Thank you all for coming tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here with you tonight. I will say before I get started that this content that we're going to share tonight is very condensed. So this is content that I teach over about a 3-week course at the design school at Stanford. And it's a 1-week intensive at the business school. So we are going to cram all that into 45 minutes, but this is a very, very smart crowd, so it'll be no problem. So let's get started. So tonight we're going to talk about user engagement and creating habit-forming technologies. And I want to start off by showing you a face that you may be familiar with. You know, when I go out and I meet with clients or I talk to companies that are trying to create user habits, I constantly see the same face, and I want to share that face with you tonight. Let me know if you might recognize him. When my boss tells me to increase engagement, I'm like, yeah, I'll get right on that. As soon as I figure out virality and I find a bunch of unicorns underneath my desk. All right, we all want user habits. We all want highly engaging products, but we really lack the tools and the resources to figure out how do we manufacture desire, so to speak. What often follows this face is a phrase like this: why can't we do it like blank? And I see some smirks and nodding heads already. And that blank is typically a company. See if this definition rings any bells. It's a kind of company that's maybe 5, 6, 7 years old, that the first time you saw the company, you saw their first products, you thought, okay, it's a nice feature, a toy, perhaps, a nice to have. And then within a blink of an eye, in a very short amount of time, these companies touch hundreds of millions of people, and some of them make billions of dollars. What companies come to mind when I mention that definition? What's that? Flipboard, okay, what else? Instagram, yeah, good example. What else? Evernote. Yeah, what else? There's a big one. Twitter, Facebook. Thank you, Facebook. How many of you thought Facebook would be Facebook in circa 2006, 2007, really? Personally, I thought it was a slightly better Friendster or MySpace, right? I didn't know it would be, what are they worth now? $70 billion is their latest market cap? So all these companies share common patterns, which I've spent the past 2 years studying, looking into what's common about these products that can so fundamentally change user behavior and user habits. And I started with a question that I was constantly asked when I was out on Sand Hill Road raising money for my last venture. I was constantly asked by investors, you know, is your product a vitamin or a painkiller? Maybe some of you have been asked this. Any of you who've started a company or even pitched a new feature within your organization, you might get this question of, does the user really need this product or this feature? Because people like to invest in painkillers, right? Painkillers are products that have an obvious need. They stop the user's pain. They have quantifiable markets, and they're eminently monetizable, right? Investors love painkillers. As opposed to vitamins, vitamins are a different story. Investors are not so keen to put money into vitamin products. Vitamins are things that address an emotional need. They're not necessarily about efficacy. They're about feeling good, knowing that you're doing something. Okay? And they typically have unknown markets when they are first developed. So here's the question. These products that we're constantly comparing ourselves to, that our bosses and our investors ask us to emulate, that profoundly change user behavior, what are they? Vitamins or painkillers? How many of you think they're vitamins? How many of you think they're painkillers? Okay, looks like an overwhelmingly vitamin crowd. Well, before you make up your mind, let me posit this thought. That a habit is when not doing something causes a bit of pain. A habit is when not doing something causes a bit of pain. Because what we find is endemic to habit-forming technologies is that they all start out as vitamins, right? They start out as pleasure-seeking behaviors, and they become pain alleviators. These products create the need and supply the remedy. Okay? Let me just back up a second to make sure I address what I mean by pain and painkillers. So it's not exactly pain that you would imagine if someone hits you in the arm. That's not exactly the pain we're talking about. We're talking about more of the itch. And to kind of get across what I mean by that itch, let's take a little a journey inside the mind for a moment. If you would, please close your eyes. I'd like you to close your eyes and imagine for a moment that you have just received a message in whatever medium you use when people in your life need to get in contact with you. So maybe that's an email, maybe that's an SMS message, maybe that's a Facebook message or something like that. Whatever medium people use to get an important message out to you. And think about that message for a bit. Close your eyes and think about that message blinking at you, waiting for you. Now I want you to bring awareness to your body, open your eyes, and someone tell me how you felt. Just shout it out. How'd you feel? Anxious, anxiety, very common response. What else? Irritated, another common response. Anything else? Anybody feel a bit of tension here in the solar plexus? Yeah, see some nodding heads. That's the itch. That's the itch. And habits are behaviors, when it comes to technology habits, these are behaviors that we do in response to those itches. Right? What I just created inside you was a physiological response to a psychological stimulus. Right? That email message or that message that I just described doesn't exist. I just made it up. Some of you are already checking your phones, I can tell. You couldn't resist. But that was a psychological stimulus which literally changed the chemistry of your brain and your body for a moment. And how we react to those changes form our technology habits, these behaviors that occur with little or no conscious thought. So my goal for tonight is if your business model requires habits, and let's make sure we address what I mean by that, that's unprompted user engagement. Okay? Unprompted user engagement is when I take out my cell phone for no good reason, right? Nothing happens, there's no phone, there's no ring. I use the product unprompted. Okay? Unprompted user engagement. That would be a habit with little or no conscious thought. What I'm going to share with you tonight is a pattern intended to help you form better product hypotheses. Okay? Many of you might be familiar with lean startup methodologies and customer development. And we have our 3 phases in lean startup methodology of build, measure, and learn. Right? How many of you are familiar with build, measure, learn? Okay, most of you. What's the most expensive part of build, measure, learn? The building, the measuring, or the learning? The building, of course, right? The measuring and the learning is fun after you've done all the hard work of building. The building is where the money, the sweat, and the tears all go. So if we can come up with better product hypotheses, we can build the right thing sooner to increase our odds of success. And these hypotheses are based, should more so be based in consumer psychology. And that's what I'm going to share with you tonight. Are we in the right place? Does this sound good for a goal for tonight? Yep, great. Okay. So this pattern designed, this pattern to form unprompted user engagement is called the hook. The hook is an experience designed to connect your user's problem with your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. Connecting your solution to the user's problem with enough frequency to form a habit. And what we find in habit-forming technologies is that these hooks exist in series, one after the other, this common pattern, one after the other throughout the product flow, taking users from states of low engagement to high engagement, forming habits along the way. And these hooks have 4 parts, 4 stages: a trigger, an action, a variable reward, and an investment. And if there's one thing I can leave you with tonight to remember in the few minutes we have together, it's Atari. How many of you had Ataris growing up? Anybody? Okay, good. So this is my generation. When I teach this class at Stanford, sometimes I have the kids looking at me like they have no idea what Atari was. So I use it as an acronym. Atari stands for a hook has 4 parts: a trigger, an action, a reward, and an investment. And as we all know, if you can make an acronym out of something, it has to be true. So let's get started. Let's start with the trigger phase. The trigger phase is the first step in connecting your solution to the user's problem with enough frequency to form a habit. And what we need to know about changing user behavior and creating new habits is that we can't pull behaviors out of thin air. We can't just will people to behave the way we've designed for them to behave and to form new habits around our products, no matter how great they are. I can't tell you how many times I work with companies where the CEO has this amazing vision for the future, and if only users would do this, this, and this, and this, someday they'd experience this amazing Shangri-La that he's designed or she's designed for them. But the user's way over here. They haven't formed the necessary behaviors to get to that intended future. Because forming new behaviors, forming new habits, is very similar to how a pearl is formed. Does anybody know how a pearl is formed? How's a pearl formed? Layer by layer, exactly. So a grain of sand is deposited inside an oyster. It's an irritant. And the oyster deposits layer upon layer of the substance called mother of pearl. So that if you cut into the center of a pearl, you would actually see rings, like the rings of a tree. And these rings are a great metaphor for how new behaviors are learned. They're based on previous behaviors, previous habits. And these previous behaviors are associated with triggers. And these triggers come in two flavors. There are external triggers and internal triggers. Now, external triggers, we in our line of work are very familiar with. All right? External triggers are where the context for what to do next is in the trigger itself. The context for what to do next, the instructions, the information for what to do next is in the trigger itself. Things like alarms, calls to action, emails, authority figures, even a storefront tell the user what to do next. We're very familiar with external triggers. What we're not as familiar with, and what I think we don't consider enough, typically, is internal triggers. Things where the context of what to do next, the information for what to do next, is an association in the user's mind. Things like emotions, routines, situations, places, certain people. All these things trigger behavior just as reliably as external triggers, but they're formed through associations with these things. So here's an example of an external trigger. We all know a big fat hero button that says log in now, right? The information of what to do next, right there. Click here. That's what that button says, log in now. But what we don't focus on enough, I believe, are these internal triggers. Particularly, what's most often an internal trigger are emotions, and more specifically, negative emotions. So what we do when we feel lost, tense, lonesome, confused, powerless, where we turn to for relief from these sensations form the basis for many of our everyday habits. Part of the evidence that this is true, in fact, is that we know that people with depression check email more. Now, why might that be? One hypothesis is that email makes us depressed, which I could kind of believe that. But in fact, this study concluded that people who feel depressed, who have clinical depression, feel what's called negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the general population. And where do they turn to relieve this pain, to relieve this discomfort? They turn to technology. So we know that people with signs of pre-depression check email more. And if you think about it in your own life, where do we turn when we feel lonely? A lot of people open up Facebook. When we feel hungry, open up Yelp or Grubhub. When we're unsure, before we even ask ourselves if we know the answer to something, we automatically Google it. When we feel anxious, for example, if we're in the elevator next to somebody we don't really want to make eye contact with, that's a great time to go ahead and check email. When we're lost, as opposed to actually thinking of, well, might we know the directions, we go ahead and use our GPS. And of course, when we're mentally fatigued, you might know this as the hours between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when you're really supposed to be working on something, but you don't really feel like it because you're just kind of tired in the afternoon when you really should be taking a nap. That's a great time to open up ESPN or some kind of news site, Pinterest, Glam, to relieve these pain points, these things that feel bad. So we seek to get out of these negative valence states. A lot of very interesting pop psychology, but what do we do with this? How do we build products to service these pain points? Well, it starts, to borrow from the words of Jack Dorsey, by knowing your customer's internal trigger, by knowing their narrative, so that you can make the statement, every time the user blanks, they use our product. Right? To relieve this pain point, they open up our product. But if we don't identify what that internal trigger is that we're attaching to, the association we're creating, It's very difficult to form a habit. So let's do a quick case study here. Let's look at Instagram. How many of you use Instagram? A few folks? OK, great, a lot of folks. Instagram's external trigger. How did most people first find out about Instagram? Word of mouth, or what else? Where did most people hear about it? Not exactly. Where did you hear about it? Facebook, of course. Facebook and Twitter. That was the viral distribution platform that Instagram used, was Facebook and Twitter. A bit of word of mouth as well. But really where they got most of their users was Facebook and Twitter. So you find out about it. There's a call to action that says, install Instagram. You install the app. Now they've got the opportunity to send you a few more external triggers through app notifications. Right? Of course, the app icon itself is an external trigger telling you what to do next. Open the app. Now, what about internal triggers? Who said they use Instagram here? Sir in the black shirt, what's your name? Craig. Craig or Greg? Greg, sorry about that. So Greg, when was the last time you took a picture with Instagram? OK, great. What did you take a picture of? If it's safe to share? Packing. So you took a picture of your belongings? OK, so your belongings, your suitcase didn't say, Greg, take a picture of me with Instagram. Right? There was no, that information was not contained in that trigger. You had an association in your head that the solution to my problem at this point is Instagram. And for most Instagram users, what Instagram was going for was the amateur photographer who wanted to satiate this fear of losing the moment. Right? I'm about to go to Burning Man. I want to capture this moment, and Instagram is my solution. Right? Instagram wins. They formed that association in Greg's mind and the minds of millions of other users. By the way, this talk of a moment, capturing the moment, does this sound familiar? Where have we heard this before? Kodak. Kodak. The difference is that Kodak spent 100 years and billions of dollars teaching us about the Kodak moment with advertising, showing us what the Kodak moment is. But Instagram didn't have to spend that money. They could show us through experiences. Right? They showed us because our friends were posting to Facebook and Twitter. We could see what the Instagram moment looks like. But of course, Instagram is much more than just about the fear of losing the moment, about capturing. Instagram is also a social network. Right? It's not just about capturing like Kodak photos did. It's also about communication. So the more we go through the hook on Instagram, the more we use it for other reasons. When we're bored, lonesome, when we're feeling FOMO. Does everybody know what FOMO is? Fear of missing out. It's in the Merriam-Webster's dictionary this year. FOMO, fear of missing out. This is a real fear, and it doesn't feel good. And we seek to satiate that pain point by using a technology. Okay? So in summary, triggers are the first step of the hook. The designer informs what to do next through external triggers. The user informs what to do next through associations with internal triggers. And finally, emotions provide frequent internal triggers. I see some of you taking pictures. That's fine, but all these slides will be available to you right afterwards as well. So, OK, so we've got the trigger. Now it's time for the action, the next step of the hook. The action phase is when doing is easier than thinking. Remember, the definition of a habit is behavior with little or no conscious thought. That's the definition of a habit. So in this action phase, when we have these moments where we act without thinking, when we have automaticity, we get this action phase. Now, the best model I know to explain singular behaviors is B.J. Fogg's behavior model. Has anybody seen this before? I'm sure some of you, right? OK, so for those of you who haven't, I think it's a great model, particularly working within startups, working within organizations, to explain why people do singular behaviors. And let me explain what this graph shows. So B.J. Fogg is a researcher here at Stanford. Sorry, there at Stanford. And Dr. Fogg posits that for any singular behavior, represented by B, we need three things at the same time. We need sufficient motivation, ability, and a trigger. Okay? So there's a threshold by which if we have a trigger present, and there's sufficient motivation, and ability, and there's enough ability. Ability is how difficult or easy. So difficult is over here. Easy is on that side. Okay? So if the user has enough ability, sufficient motivation, and a trigger is present, we get that behavior. If we don't have sufficient motivation or the behavior is too hard, no behavior occurs. Okay? And this explains all human behavior, if you think about it. So let's make this concrete. Think of the last time that a phone rang in your life and you didn't pick it up. Why didn't you pick it up? Give me a reason. It wasn't your phone. I've never heard that one before, but that's a good one. All right, that's actually both motivation and ability, right? It's too socially not acceptable to pick up somebody else's phone, and you didn't feel like picking it up, so you didn't have either. Somebody give me one. Great. So you heard the phone ring. It's right next to you, but the caller ID said unknown number. You're thinking it's a telemarketer. Your motivation is too low. You don't pick it up. What's another reason? Yeah. Great. So there's some difficulty socially to pick up the call. Even though you really wanted to pick up the call, it's too difficult. It's too difficult at that moment. Your ability is too low because you're in a meeting. It's socially inappropriate. What's one more reason that has to do with a trigger? Why you may not pick up a phone because you didn't hear the trigger. So motivation could be low, but what about the trigger? You didn't hear it ring. So what if the phone's on silent? You really wanted to pick up the call. I'm sure this has happened to somebody here, right? You really wanted to pick up the call. The phone was right next to you. You could have picked it up. It was right next to you. Darn thing was on silent. No trigger was present. So to get any singular behavior, we need these three things at the same time: sufficient motivation, ability, and a trigger. Okay? Let's dive into each one of these. Motivation, according to Edward Deci, the father of self-determination theory, is the energy for action. And there have been all sorts of papers written and different hypotheses around the basis for human motivation. Since the dawn of the field of psychology, people have been pontificating about the source of human motivation. B.J. Fogg posits that there's 6 big categories. And this is up for debate, but it's simple enough to be useful. That there are 6 levers, essentially, 6 things that we as designers can pull on to increase or decrease user motivation. And these are that people seek pleasure, avoid pain. We seek hope, we avoid fear. We seek social acceptance, and we avoid social rejection. Okay? 6 levers that move people up and down the motivation axis. One field where we see people working in this field of motivation to sell things is, of course, advertising. So I'll show you some ads, and I'd like you to tell me what motivator is being used. Okay? Not what's being sold, but what motivator is being used. And the first one's a freebie. What's the motivator here? Obviously, it's written across the bottom of the ad, but even without the word hope, what's the president looking towards? The future. Of course, he's looking towards the future. Okay, here's another one. What's the motivator? Sex, more specific. You're right. That's exactly right. What's the age and demographic, age and sex of the person these ads are targeted towards? Teenage boys. That's exactly right. Teenage boys. And for teenage boys, sex is a salient motivator associated with pleasure. For other demographics, it completely doesn't work, right? In fact, it turns other demographics off. But for this demographic, right, sex and hamburgers have nothing to do with each other, but it's a salient motivator for this demographic of teenage boys. Here's another one. What's the motivator that's being used here? Social acceptance, exactly, right? Having a beer with my buds. So that's motivation. Let's talk about ability. Ability is the capacity to do something, capacity to do the behavior. And here again, we have different levers that we can pull to make something more or less likely, a behavior more or less likely to occur based on making it easier or harder. Here again, there are 6 factors of ability, which include time, money, physical effort, brain cycles, also known as cognitive load, right? How difficult something is to understand makes it more or less likely the behavior will occur. Social deviance, how different is it from what other people are doing? And then finally, non-routine. Just the fact that I've done a similar behavior before makes it more likely I'll do it in the future. This is why habits have feedback loops, right? This is why we don't care if Bing is any better than Google. We don't care because we're so used to using it that we have a feedback loop that makes us use it again and again. So even though Bing, I don't know if you remember this campaign that Bing had a few years ago, where they, actually last year, where they compared Google to Bing side by side, and they wanted users to type in their search query so that they could prove that Bing was better. And nobody cared. Because we've already increased our ability so far down the curve of using Google that doesn't really solve our problem anymore to use something else. Okay? So all these factors of ability and motivation influence singular behaviors. That's what this phase of the hook is all about, singular behaviors. And these are all simple simple behaviors in anticipation of reward. The simplest behavior, in fact, in anticipation of reward. And let me show you how simple these behaviors are online. Something as simple as and easy as logging in on Facebook or WordPress, searching on Google or Expedia or Yelp, opening Twitter or an SMS or an email, something as simple as scrolling on Instagram or Pinterest, pushing the play button on YouTube or an online game. Right? The simplest action in anticipation of reward. Let's do another quick survey here, a quick case study. Let's look at Twitter circa 2009, Twitter 2010, and Twitter today. So what's changed? What do you see that's changed in terms of motivation, ability, and triggers? What do you see? Yep, a lot less explanation on what Twitter is, right? Here it's even asking the user. I'm not sure why they asked the user. Maybe they weren't sure of what Twitter. I'm not really sure. It says, what is Twitter? I don't know. Here, find out about what's happening with the people and organizations you care about. Sign in or sign up. That's it. The intended behavior is very clear, and all the cognitive load has been removed. Sign in or sign up, not all this other stuff. Right? So they've increased the user's ability. They've made it easier to do the intended behavior by erasing cognitive load, by taking as much cognitive load away. Now, Twitter is also in a very different place today than it was in 2009. The user came in with a different pretext in 2009 than they do today, right? So that the lesson here is not go straight to Twitter 2013. The lesson here is to reduce cognitive load as much as possible, to simplify as much as possible, to achieve the intended behavior. So in summary, the action phase is the second step of the hook. The action is the simplest behavior in anticipation of reward. And to increase behavior, the first thing we do is ensure a clear trigger is present. I can't tell you how many times I go, and I'm sure you've seen this as well. You go into a fancy UX review, and we sit down and we look at the product, and I say, I don't know where to press. What am I supposed to do next? Where's the trigger? So first step is always a clear trigger is present. Then we increase ability by making it easier, simplifying the intended behavior. And then last, we align with the right motivator. Okay, the motivator is the hardest thing to move. Always want to start in this order. OK, so we figured out the trigger, the itch the user is coming to scratch, the simplest action before a reward, and now it's time for the actual reward, right? The thing the user came for. When we talk about reward, we need to talk about the brain, and specifically an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. That was first researched by two scientists by the name of Olds and Milner back in the 1940s and 50s, who discovered that when they implanted an electrode in the brains of lab animals. Let me change this slide. It's a little gruesome. I can see some of you squirming. When they implanted electrodes in the brains of lab animals and then later human subjects, they saw that people would self-stimulate this area of the brain incessantly. They would keep clicking on this self-stimulating device nonstop. They would forgo food and water and everything else to keep stimulating this area of the brain. And we know that this area of the brain is also stimulated by other things. This nucleus accumbens, this dead center of your brain, right in the middle, that this nucleus accumbens is also active with other things. Things like junk food and sex and a sale and, of course, technology. So when Olds and Milner first started studying the nucleus accumbens, they thought they had discovered the pleasure center. Right? Why else would these lab animals and later human subjects, why would they keep self-stimulating if it didn't feel good? Well, it turned out they weren't actually stimulating the pleasure center. They were stimulating the stress of desire. And in fact, they were satiating the stress of desire. Because what we know is that the neurotransmitter dopamine runs through the nucleus accumbens and is most active in anticipation of reward. And we can literally see this happening. This was a study that was done at Stanford back in 2001, where the nucleus accumbens, the area studied by Olds and Milner, was most active when people were placed into an fMRI machine and asked to gamble. They literally started wagering inside these fMRI machines that were looking inside their brain. So this nucleus accumbens became active in anticipation of reward and became inactive after the reward was received. So it was all about this stress of desire. And in fact, we know that we can supercharge this stress of desire. Anybody want to know how? Anybody curious? Yeah? Exactly. The unknown is fascinating. So let's take a step back. Let's think about, why do we have habits in the first place? Why have we evolved to have these mechanisms to form habits? Well, it's because our brains are fundamentally prediction machines. We benefit by being able to understand cause and effect, so that after we experience something once or twice, we can encode it into our memory and not have to continually think about it. It's habitual. We act without thinking. And so what we know is that when variability is involved, when there's a bit of mystery, when I took that long pause and said, does anybody want to know what supercharges the stress of desire? Question mark. When there was the unknown, it increased your focus, it increased engagement, and also it's highly habit-forming. So some of the first studies that showed this was the work of somebody you might remember from your Psych 101 class back in college, B.F. Skinner, who saw that intermittent rewards increased response rates. His famous experiment was taking a pigeon, putting it into what was called a Skinner box, and he let the pigeon click on a lever for a reward. And at first, every time the pigeon would click, they would receive a reward. Click, receive a food pellet. Then he introduced a bit of variability, an intermittent reward. So the pigeon would click, receive a food pellet. Click again, but nothing came out. Click again, now something would come out. Another pellet would come out. So that variability, that intermittent reward, Skinner found increased response rates. The pigeon began clicking with much more frequency. So what we now know is that variability spikes dopamine, and dopamine drives this search, this endless search for reward. Okay? And what we find is that these variable rewards mechanisms are in all sorts of products, online and off, that create habits, that create engagement. And as you leave here tonight, I hope that you'll take a look at kind of the things that you and other people in your life find most compelling, things that you can't stop doing or have difficulty stopping doing or do perhaps mindlessly, and find the variable rewards, which come, I believe, in 3 different types, 3 flavors. And many products have multiple of these reward types. I call them rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. So let's explore all 3. The first is the search for social rewards, what I call rewards of the tribe. So this is about rewards that come from other people. Things like cooperation, competition, recognition, acceptance, sex, empathetic joy. Things that feel good from other people that have an element of the unknown, that have a bit of unpredictability to them. Think, of course, of social networking. Mark Zuckerberg gets married and 1.3 million people like it. Right? Think about all the variability that's involved with social networking. What is somebody going to post? How many people are going to like it? What are they going to comment back? Very high degree of variability involved with social networking. How many of you here use Stack Overflow? Anybody here? A few folks? Great. Stack Overflow, who, for those of you who don't use the site, is the world's largest technical question and answer site in the world. 5,000 questions get asked and answered every single day, and these are not easily answerable questions. These are highly technical questions that take a lot of time to answer. Why do people do it? Why do people spend so much time answering these questions? Well, on Stack Overflow, there's an element of rewards of the tribe. Every time you post an answer, you put it up to the community to do what's called an upvote. So you get a little point every time someone thinks you provided a good answer. And these upvotes translate into points. These points translate into badges. And these aren't things that we show just, people don't show their badges for decoration. They confer social status. They say to the others in my tribe, in my community, that I'm valued by the people I care about, by the people whose opinion I respect. And there's a high degree of variability, right? If I take the time to post an answer, how many upvotes am I going to get? What's going to happen? There's a lot of variability to that, all around rewards of the tribe. Next is the search for resources, what I call rewards of the hunt. So that stems from our search for food. Food in industrial society is translated into money, and in modern society, information. So when many people think of variable rewards, they often think of gambling, right? That slot machines have a variable reward mechanism around money. But what we often don't consider is the variable rewards around information. Think about the feed. So the feed is all of a sudden in so many products that we didn't see it before, right? Instagram now has a feed. Many, many products use this feed mechanism now. You ever wonder why? Well, it's because it's a system of variable reward. Think about it. So that first tweet, that's not very interesting. The second tweet, no, that's not very interesting. The third one, oh, that's interesting. And to receive more, what do I have to do? Just keep scrolling. And this becomes very similar to this. If you want to see the masters of this, take a look at Pinterest, where I dare you not to scroll. Very hard not to scroll. In fact, they call it that system is called the infinite scroll, right? You can literally keep scrolling and scrolling forever and ever. Now, what's interesting, I actually got this comic, for those of you who may not be able to see it so well, sorry that the type is kind of small. It's got a little guy hunched over his desk, and he says, scroll, 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 and then he says, and then scroll, scroll, scroll. And that's exactly the behavior. This searching and never done searching through rewards through variable reward mechanism. And finally, the search for sensation. These are things that have a variable component, but don't come from other people, are not about material rewards or information rewards. They're about rewards of the self. So for those of you who might be familiar with self-determination theory, perhaps you read Daniel Pink's book, Drive. Mastery, consistency, competency, completion. These are things that feel good in and of themselves, intrinsic rewards. So where we see this happening a lot is with gameplay, right? Getting to the next level, mastering a challenge. Variable rewards of the self. And if you say to yourself, you know, those games, I never got them. That's not for me. I bet you play this game every day, right? The need to check that one last email, right? To eliminate that jewel on an app icon, to get that out of the way. It's about the variable rewards mechanism around completion and mastery. Okay? That itch you felt earlier when I described that message waiting for you. So some words of warning for designers who are thinking about implementing variable rewards. They are not a free pass. So let me give you some words of warning. Number one, we still have to solve the user's pain. Variable rewards are not a free pass. We still need to scratch the itch they came for, which is why we have to understand their internal triggers and their motivators. Right? If we can't identify the itch they're coming to scratch, we can't give them the right variable reward. Second, there's no such thing as engagement without autonomy. We know that people resist feeling controlled. In fact, there's a psychological phenomenon called reactance, where that if someone feels manipulated, if someone feels controlled, they push back. So if you've ever had your boss micromanage you, or your mom tell you to wear a sweater when you know perfectly well what temperature it is outside, that's reactance. Right? We push away from feeling like our autonomy is being infringed upon. So we always have to maintain a feeling of autonomy, and that if we lose that, we fail. The user bounces. Okay? And then finally, finite rewards decay. So at this point in the presentation, some people start thinking about video games and start saying, well, if variable rewards are so great, why are we all still playing Super Mario Brothers? And Farmville, for that matter, right? Everybody was playing Farmville a couple years ago, and what happened to Farmville? That's full of variable rewards. Well, let's think about that for a moment. Zynga released Farmville, most successful game in history at the time. And then what did Zynga release after Farmville? What was the next game? Anybody remember? Cityville. And then after Cityville came, I think it was Frontierville, and then Chefville, and then Farmville 2. And users started figuring out that it was the same frames over and over again. And what happened to that variability? It became predictable. So that's a great example. Video games are a great example, some video games, of finite variability, where there's an end. So for example, in a Farmville game, users started figuring out the variability. It got old after a while because there was a finite point to how variable it was. Think about it in the context of consumption of media. When you're in a movie, when you're in a movie theater, or you're reading a great book, and you don't know how it's going to end, there's a high degree of mystery. And the unknown, you're very engaged. But as soon as you finish the book, as soon as the movie ends, and you know how everything wraps up, you leave. Right? And very few books do we read more than once. Very few movies do we watch again. At a proportion of all the ones that are new every year, very, very few of them become cult classics that we ever watch again. As opposed to infinite variability, these are things like multiplayer games, or the creation of content, or communities. Think about why social networks engage us for so long. Well, our friends are infinitely variable. They're always changing. There's a much higher degree of what's going on with our social network than with finite rewards. So in summary, variable rewards are the third step of the hook. There are 3 reward types: rewards of the tribe, hunt, and self. We must maintain a feeling of autonomy, find infinite variability, and most of all, alleviate the user's pain, scratch the user's itch. So we've triggered the user. We've provided them with the simplest action before a reward. We've given them what they came for, but leaving them wanting more. And then finally, it's time for the investment phase. The investment phase is my favorite part of the hook, because it's the one I see the most opportunities, untaken opportunities with the companies I consult with. They often leave off this critical phase of the hook, which is the investment phase. Without the investment phase, all you've got is a feedback loop. But when it comes to products, we have to get the user to invest. The investment phase is where the user does a bit of work. It's where they pay with something of value, like time, money, social capital, effort, emotional commitment, data, something that makes the product better with use. You know, one of the reasons that I love working in technology as opposed to, the physical world, so to speak, is that everything in this room, your computers, your phones, the tables, the chairs, all these things depreciate with time. But habit-forming technology has the ability to appreciate. It can get better with use. And so this investment phase is all about actions the user can take to increase the likelihood of the next pass. It's done in anticipation of future reward, not immediate reward, future rewards, and it makes the next pass through the hook more likely in 3 ways. Loads the next trigger, stores value, and creates preference. And let me show you how the investment phase does those 3 things. So does anybody here use AnyDo? Any do user? Oh, okay, a few users. So AnyDo, it's funny, every time I give this presentation, more and more people use it. It's a to-do list. That's all it is, just a to-do list, a task list. But they do something really interesting in the app. The first time you use the app puts you to work. It tells you what to do. It says, pull down to create a new task. Do this, do that. One of the things you have to do is to connect it to your calendar so that the next time you walk out of your meeting, AnyDo pops up and says, hey, we just saw you finished a meeting. Do you have any to-dos from that meeting? So they've loaded the next trigger. Let me show you how Pinterest does it. So you've signed up to Pinterest. You receive an email notification that says your friend Jane just posted something onto Pinterest. That's the external trigger, the email notification. The simplest action before a reward is to log in. Just log in. That's all you got to do. To receive that reward, which is around communication, your friend Jane just did something. You want to know what she did to communicate with her. That's the variable reward, along with, while you're there, you'll keep browsing. Right? Pinterest is all about the search for rewards of the hunt, collecting as well. Right? It's about these interesting items. Look at the investment phase. Every time I pin, repin, like, comment, I'm giving them the opportunity to message me again. I'm loading the next trigger. So that through successive cycles through the hook, I'm using the product for other reasons. Right? It's becoming a way to alleviate boredom, loneliness. I'm using it for other reasons, other than just the external trigger. It's teaching me what the product is for. So that's loading the next trigger. The other thing that the investment phase done is stores value. So there's a few ways to store value. One is content. The more pictures I take on Instagram, the more it becomes my photo album. Right? The more I store my valuable moments inside Instagram. Data. Every time I use Evernote, the more I use it, it becomes my external brain. I store data in it. I store content in it. Followers. So the more I use Facebook and Twitter, the more valuable it becomes to me because I'm better able to reach people in my tribe, in my community. It becomes more valuable with more followers. And then finally, reputation. So when I use eBay or Airbnb or TaskRabbit, I can literally take my reputation to the bank because I can charge more for the goods and services that I'm selling. Right? So these are all forms of stored value, which make it less likely for me to leave this service for a competitor, forming new habits. So loading the next trigger, storing value, and then finally creating preference. So there's kind of a golden calf in our community, in the UX, UI community, around ease of use, that everything should be easy to use. And didn't I just tell you that in the action phase, that's what it's all about, right? The simplest action before a reward. And I'm sure you've heard that 100 times before me. But I'm here to tell you that in the investment phase, if you don't take the opportunity to get the user to do a bit of work, you're missing an opportunity. And let me show you some data that shows this. For one, we know that labor increases value. That when people do a bit of work, they literally value that product more. They change their opinion of the product. Let me give you an example. People are willing to take worse odds when they fill out their own lotto numbers. Why is that? Think about this from a usability perspective. Isn't it easier to go up to the cash register when I buy a lotto ticket and push a button and get my numbers? And yet we know that people will trade worse odds if they've taken the time and effort to fill out these little SAT-style bubble sheets. Right? Not the best ease of use experience. Here's another example of how labor is love. Dan Ariely wrote a great book called Predictably Irrational, and he also did some work with Michael Norton over at Harvard, where he asked people to build origami frogs. Except he made it a little tricky. Psychologists love to add tricks into their studies. He took out some of the instructions on how to make these origami frogs so that when people made the frogs, they were a little harder to make than they should have been. And then he asked them how much these frogs were worth to them. And he found that people said that their origami frogs were almost as valuable as an expert's, even though other people thought their frogs were crap. So Ariely calls this the IKEA effect, that we irrationally value the things that we put labor into. As we invest, we seek to be consistent with our past behaviors. So this labor that we put into a product literally changes our perception of it. An example of this is a great study that was done in Palo Alto back in the 60s, where they asked two groups of homeowners to put a 3-foot sign, a big old 3-foot sign that said, "Please drive carefully." It said the same thing, but it didn't look like this. It said, "Please drive carefully." The first group, only 17% accepted. The rest said, "Get off my property." The second group, 76% accepted. What was the difference? What was the change? The difference is that with group 2, these researchers had approached 2 weeks prior and asked them to put a 3-inch sign in their car, a bumper sticker in their car that said the same exact thing: "Please drive carefully." They went back 2 weeks later, and look at the change. Right? I'm sorry. They went back 2 weeks later and asked them to put the 3-foot sign, and you can see the change. So we seek to be consistent with our past behaviors. These little bits of work, these investments, they shape our tastes, they shape our preferences, and they shape our identities. They literally change the way we perceive the products we use, these bits of work. So in summary, the investment phase is the 4th step of the hook. These are small amounts of work that increase the likelihood of the user passing through the hook again by loading the next trigger, storing value, and finally creating preference. So that's the hook model. It's an experience designed to connect your solution to the user's problem with enough frequency to form a habit. Remember it through Atari. A hook has 4 parts: a trigger, an action, a reward, and an investment. And that these hooks in series, in the user flow, in the user experience, take the user from states of needing external triggers to creating associations with internal triggers, from states of low preference to high preference, from states of low engagement to high engagement. And what you can do with this, what I hope you'll take back to your companies, is to take this hook canvas and ask these 5 fundamental questions of, number 1, what does the user really want? What's the itch they're coming to scratch? That's the internal trigger, and it's usually deeper than what we often think it is. It's an emotion, it's a routine, it's a situation, it's a narrative that we can describe emotionally. Second, what's the external trigger? What brings the user to the product? Third, what's the simplest action in anticipation of reward? What's the reward? How is the user scratching that itch and yet leaves them wanting more? And then finally, what's the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the user returning next time? So, final question. What are you going to do with this? So many of these techniques that I'm sharing with you that come out of user psychology and consumer psychology have sometimes been used for time-wasting purposes or even nefarious reasons. But a big part of why I do what I do is because I think we can use this same methodology to cultivate meaning, to help people live better, healthier, happier lives by creating habits for good. The world is full of problems to fix. We have no shortage of those. And I think we can use habits to help people find meaning and to help engage them in something important. And to build on the words of Gandhi, I hope that you as designers will use this knowledge to build the change you want to see in the world. Thank you very much. So before you go, I have one final request. If you can please raise your phones. Everybody have a phone or something that's connected to the web? I love feedback. And as I promised you, you've got some slides here if you'd like them. If you can go to this website, www.opinion2.us. Notice it's not .com, it's opinion2.us. And if you fill out this very, very short 5-question survey, tell me what you liked, what you didn't like. It'll take you about a minute or less. After you do that, click Submit, and you'll go to my SlideShare page where you can have all these slides and do with them whatever you wish. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions if we have time. Paul, not sure. Yeah, please.
Wait.
Oh.
So a lot of the examples you showed, like email and Facebook, I find that these are creating an itch that when I scratch just itches more. Do you have any examples of habit formation like these that are for good?
Sure. So there's a whole explosion of companies now, habits for good. So let me be clear. If you look at my blog, it's kind of schizophrenic because I write half about how to form habit-forming products, how to build habit-forming products, and the other half is about how to resist habit-forming products. Because I really think that it's a new challenge that we as consumers have to be aware of and we have to face. And the only way to do something about it is to realize what the heck is going on. Right? We have to understand these 4 phases of the hook so that we can break it, and so that we can use it for good. And I think we will. We'll develop what Paul Graham calls antibodies for these addictive behaviors and habit-forming, or bad habits as well. Now, I also believe that we can use habits for good. So there's this explosion now of companies that are using habit-forming technologies to help people manage their weight, to exercise more, to be more productive, to achieve their goals. That's really what I hope I'll see more products come out and utilize. And I think we will see those. We already are starting to see some of these.
What are examples of bad habits?
There's so many examples of bad habits. I don't know. I mean, frankly, I don't know anybody in the Valley who doesn't struggle with the internet, including myself. Part of the reason I do what I do is because I find myself often mindlessly using technology. I wrote this maybe a little too revealing article called "The Strange Sex Habits of Silicon Valley" that described how, every evening I was going to bed and I was caressing my iPhone and my iPad instead of my wife, and how that sucks. So what did I do? I looked at the hook and I decided I had to break it. So I looked for all kinds of methods to break the hook cycle. One thing was to make sure that triggers don't become actions. So what did I do? I went to Home Depot, I bought a $5 timer that every evening at 10 o'clock turns off my router. I broke the hook. I also took all technology out of my bedroom. The phones don't charge by my bureau, as they do for 2/3 of Americans with cell phones. My phones charge in the living room. Right? So it's not the first thing I do in the morning. The first thing I do in the morning is kiss my wife good morning. I'm not beholden by my technology. I'm trying not to lose sleep because of the availability of that technology being so close to me. So I think I'm looking for more. I'm constantly looking. If you know of other ways to help break technology habits, send them to me, because I'm constantly looking for how to do that. We have to be smarter around how to control our technology habits. Because I do believe the world is becoming a more addictive place.
Thanks, Nir. So you were referencing BJ's framework. I don't know if you could bring it up just for a second, because I remember you saying that you managed to take the boot camp, and so you might be able to help explain something that I've kind of gotten hung on, which is there's one axis which is motivation that goes from 0 to 10, the y-axis there. And I was just wondering, do you know any way to measure motivation besides whether people do things?
Yeah. I think it's, it looks like math, that B equals MAT. There's no math there. It's not E equals MC squared.
Right.
When it comes to psychology, there's a lot of squishiness. And I think it's a conceptual model of, I think where this model is most useful is not necessarily degrees. It's in a common vocabulary that we can use in our companies to say, okay, the user's not doing the intended behavior. What's missing? Which factor of motivation is missing? Which factor of ability is in the user's way? That's where I think it's most useful. Now, one way to measure motivation and ability and triggers is whether the user did the behavior.
That does seem like a circle, though, doesn't it? Like,
I'm sorry.
because, I mean, like, if the ability is measuring the motivation, and then you measure how much is motivated by whether they're able to do it, it doesn't seem like there's two independent quantities there.
Well, you can change one thing or the other, right? You can try moving one factor of ability, seeing if that creates the intended behavior, and match it one at a time. I'm just saying, as a whole, we can test, we can keep elements constant, test certain things on the ability curve, and see if it makes a difference in creating the intended behavior.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, by the way, I have to have a disclaimer that I don't think this is the perfect model. I think there's a lot of stuff.
I think you're right, though, that it creates a vocabulary that
Exactly.
focuses people on the fact that...
I like to say it's simple enough to be useful, right? If we want it to be super accurate, it becomes too complex to be useful. What I care about is the makers, the startup folks who are trying to build products. And for them, this is very useful.
Okay, well, let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you.